The white Ford Transit van rolled slowly into the driveway in Northport, Florida. September 1, 2021. Neighbors noticed something strange almost immediately. Brian Laundrie was back. But Gabby Petito wasn't. No frantic explanation. No missing person report. No visible panic. Just silence. Days later, police bodycam footage would begin circulating across the internet. Gabby crying. Brian calm. A witness saying he saw a man hitting a woman. A young couple parked beside a road in Utah. At first, it looked like an ordinary domestic dispute. But the longer investigators studied those moments, the more unsettling they became. Because hidden inside that footage were details nobody fully understood yet. Details that would eventually transform a social media road trip into one of the most disturbing disappearances in America. And by the time the country realized what it was actually looking at, Gabby Petito was already gone. August 12, 2021. Moab, Utah. The heat sat heavy over the desert roads. Tourists moved through Arches National Park. Campers filled gas stations. Everything looked normal. But earlier that afternoon, a 911 dispatcher received a call. A witness described a man slapping a woman outside a grocery store. The caller sounded uncertain at first. Then more confident. The couple left in a white van. Police eventually located the vehicle near the entrance to the park. What happened next would later be replayed millions of times. Bodycam footage showed a visibly emotional Gabby Petito sitting inside the van. She was crying. Apologizing. Trying to explain herself. Brian Laundrie stood nearby. Calm. Relaxed. Smiling at times. To responding officers, the situation initially appeared chaotic but manageable. Two stressed young travelers. An argument. A difficult road trip. Nothing more. At least, that's what it looked like on the surface. But viewers watching the footage months later began noticing small details. The imbalance in emotion. The way Gabby repeatedly blamed herself. The way Brian redirected conversations. The way officers slowly began treating Gabby as the primary emotional problem. And one question kept resurfacing. If this moment was captured on camera, what wasn't? Before the disappearance. Before the nationwide manhunt. Before headlines turned their names into internet obsession. Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie looked like a modern American dream. Young. Attractive. Nomadic. Two people abandoning traditional life to travel across the country in a converted van. To millions online, they represented freedom. But even early on, there were subtle fractures underneath the image. And those fractures become impossible to ignore once the timeline is reconstructed carefully. Because almost every major warning sign appeared before Gabby vanished. The problem was, nobody knew how to interpret them yet. Gabrielle Venora Petito was born on March 19, 1999. Friends described her as creative, emotionally expressive, and deeply invested in relationships. She enjoyed photography, art, travel, social media. But more than anything, Gabby seemed drawn toward building experiences around connection. People who knew her often described her as sensitive. Not weak. Sensitive. There's an important difference. Sensitive people notice emotional shifts quickly. They adapt. They try to restore harmony. And later, investigators and behavioral analysts would revisit that trait repeatedly. Because in emotionally imbalanced relationships, the person most desperate to maintain peace often absorbs blame. Even when they shouldn't. Brian Laundrie projected a different energy. Quiet. Reserved. At times detached. Friends later described him as intelligent but difficult to fully read. He appeared intensely opinionated about certain topics. Minimalism. Environmentalism. Control over lifestyle. Control over routines. Control over surroundings. That word, control, would quietly emerge again and again throughout the case. Not dramatically. Subtly. In behavior. In conversations. In reactions. And eventually, in silence. The two met while living in New York. Their relationship escalated quickly. By 2020, they were engaged. Online, they looked inseparable. Photos showed hiking trails, smiling selfies, beach sunsets, road trip aesthetics. To outside viewers, the relationship appeared adventurous and spontaneous. But long before the public saw police footage in Utah, there were signs the relationship functioned unevenly beneath the surface. Gabby appeared emotionally dependent on preserving the relationship. Brian often appeared emotionally detached during conflict. That imbalance matters, because investigators later noticed a recurring pattern. Whenever tension emerged, Gabby tried to fix it. Even when she appeared distressed. Even when witnesses described Brian as the aggressor. And that pattern becomes critically important once the road trip begins. In July of 2021, Gabby and Brian launched what they hoped would become a new life. A cross-country van journey through America's national parks. The plan fit perfectly into a rapidly growing online trend. Van life. Minimal living. Escaping conventional routines. Documenting freedom through carefully curated content. Gabby appeared especially invested in making the project successful. She worked on social media branding, photography, editing, video concepts. She wanted the trip to mean something. Not just personally, professionally. The van itself became part of the identity. White exterior, compact interior. A small moving world shared by two people. And in the beginning, the content worked. Photos from Kansas, Colorado, Utah. Beautiful landscapes. Smiling faces. Romantic captions. The illusion of peace. But something else was happening quietly in the background. The longer two people remain isolated together inside confined spaces, the harder emotional patterns become to hide. Road trips magnify relationships. Stress compounds. Minor disagreements intensify. And unlike ordinary life, there's nowhere to retreat. No separate apartments. No work schedules. No distance. Just constant proximity. Hours together. Every day. Inside a van. Thousands of miles from home. At first, small signs began surfacing online. Subtle tension in videos. Changes in tone. Moments where Gabby appeared anxious. Nothing definitive. But enough that some followers later revisiting the footage described an underlying discomfort they hadn't noticed before. Then came one of the most revealing details in the entire case. A seemingly minor argument over cleanliness. According to police reports later released after the Moab incident, Gabby told officers she struggled with anxiety and became upset about disorder inside the van. Brian reportedly complained that she was emotional, messy, overwhelmed. At first glance, it sounds ordinary. Couples argue constantly during long trips. But when investigators reconstructed later events, that argument took on a different meaning. Because it introduced a pattern. Gabby internalized blame. Brian externalized responsibility. One person apologizing. The other distancing himself. That dynamic would appear again. And again. And again. As summer continued, Gabby's online activity became more carefully curated. On August 19th, the couple uploaded a YouTube video titled Van Life, Beginning Our Van Life Journey. The footage looked cinematic. Bright skies. Laughter. Hiking shots. Romantic embraces. Coffee scenes. Music. Movement. Freedom. To viewers, the relationship looked ideal. But investigators later noted something psychologically important about the video. It wasn't spontaneous. It was constructed. Multiple takes. Selective moments. Edited reality. That distinction matters because throughout the case, one of the central questions became how much of their relationship existed online, and how much existed privately. The answer was uncomfortable. Because the public eventually realized they had been watching two completely different stories unfold at the same time. One polished. One deteriorating. And somewhere between those two realities, Gabby disappeared. August 12th. Moab, Utah. The bodycam footage begins with flashing lights and desert heat. The van pulls over awkwardly near the road. An officer approaches. Gabby is visibly emotional almost immediately. Her breathing is uneven. Her voice shakes. She apologizes repeatedly. Meanwhile, Brian speaks calmly. At times he even jokes with officers. This contrast became one of the most discussed elements of the case. Not because calmness proves guilt. It doesn't. But because behavioral imbalance during high-stress events often reveals relational dynamics. One person emotionally flooded. The other composed. One person self-blaming. The other controlling the pace of interaction. At first, officers appeared uncertain who the primary aggressor was. Gabby admitted she slapped Brian. She described escalating anxiety. Brian described her as emotional and overwhelmed. But there was a problem. The original 911 caller reportedly described seeing Brian strike Gabby. That discrepancy would later become critically important. Because somewhere between the witness statement and the roadside interaction, the narrative shifted. Slowly. Subtly. Almost invisibly. Gabby began framing herself as the problem. And investigators later questioned whether officers fully recognized what they were actually observing. Not physical violence alone, but emotional imbalance, control dynamics, conflict management. The footage itself became haunting for another reason. Gabby seemed desperate to stabilize the situation. She worried about being separated. Worried about the trip. Worried about disrupting plans. Even during visible distress, her focus repeatedly returned toward preserving the relationship. That matters psychologically. Because people experiencing unstable relationship dynamics often prioritize restoring calm over examining danger. And Brian's demeanor throughout the stop raised additional questions later. He appeared relaxed. Comfortable with officers. Able to redirect conversations naturally. At one point, he referenced Gabby's anxiety. Again. And again. The framing gradually moved toward mental health strain rather than interpersonal threat. Officers ultimately decided not to file charges. Instead, they separated the couple for the night. Brian stayed at a hotel. Gabby kept the van. At the time, the encounter looked resolved. Temporary. Routine. But months later, millions of viewers watched that footage with completely different eyes. Not because they knew the ending. But because once a tragedy occurs, early moments acquire new meaning. Expressions become clues. Pauses become suspicious. Words become evidence. And one question became impossible to ignore. If this was how the relationship looked in public, what happened when nobody else was around? After the Moab incident, the trip continued. At least publicly. Photos still appeared online. Travel content continued. The relationship seemed functional again. But investigators later reconstructed the timeline carefully and noticed something important. The emotional atmosphere appeared increasingly unstable beneath the surface. And small details started accumulating. Not dramatic details. Subtle ones. The kind investigators often overlook early because individually they mean almost nothing. But placed together inside a timeline, they become difficult to ignore. One witness later described seeing tension between Gabby and Brian at a restaurant in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. According to reports, Brian became visibly angry with staff. Gabby reportedly apologized afterward. Again, the same pattern. Conflict. Escalation. Repair. Gabby smoothing tension. And investigators eventually noticed something psychologically significant about that recurring dynamic. People who consistently manage another person's emotional state often begin minimizing their own distress. The relationship gradually revolves around preventing escalation, not mutual stability. Preventing escalation. That distinction becomes crucial later. Because once Gabby's communication with family changed, the timeline became far more concerning. During late August, Gabby's contact with relatives reportedly became inconsistent. Texts felt unusual. Calls became less predictable. Nothing immediately alarming, but enough that her mother later noticed subtle differences. Then came one of the strangest details in the entire case. A text referencing Gabby's grandfather by his first name. According to family statements, Gabby normally never addressed him that way. On its own, the message meant nothing. People text differently all the time. But placed inside the timeline, it became unsettling. Because investigators eventually began asking a broader question. Who was actually sending the messages during Gabby's final days? And if some communications weren't written by Gabby, when exactly did control over the narrative change hands? That's when the case shifts psychologically. Because disappearances rarely begin with dramatic moments. They begin with subtle interruptions in normal behavior. Changes people dismiss initially. Small inconsistencies. Delayed replies. A sentence that feels slightly off. And in hindsight, those details often become impossible to forget. Meanwhile, online audiences continued seeing fragments of the road trip. Photos. Smiles. Landscapes. Movement. But behind the curated content, the timeline was beginning to fracture. And one of the biggest reasons the case exploded nationally was because the public eventually realized they could watch that fracture happening almost in real time. Digital footprints. Instagram activity. Witness sightings. YouTube uploads. Bodycam footage. Every piece created another question. And unlike older cases, this story unfolded during the height of social media investigation culture. Millions of people weren't just consuming the case. They were analyzing it. Comparing timestamps. Tracking locations. Watching facial expressions. Studying behavior. Trying to identify the exact moment the story changed. But the most disturbing part is this. The critical warning signs may have already appeared publicly before Gabby was ever officially reported missing. The problem was, nobody recognized them yet. Late August. Grand Teton National Park. The environment itself almost feels cinematic. Open landscapes. Forests. Mountain roads. Isolation. And somewhere inside that isolation, the timeline begins collapsing. Gabby's final confirmed communications occur around this period. After that, uncertainty spreads rapidly. Witnesses later describe seeing Brian alone. One account places him hitchhiking near Wyoming. Another describes unusual behavior around the van. Individually, each sighting remained uncertain. But together they formed something investigators couldn't ignore. A growing separation between Brian's movements and Gabby's known activity. And then there's the behavioral question. Why return home alone? That detail seems obvious now. But at the time, nobody outside the relationship knew Gabby was missing. Which means somewhere during those final days, Brian allegedly made a critical psychological calculation. Silence over explanation. Distance over confrontation. Control through absence. And that decision would eventually become one of the defining features of the case. Because once Brian returned to Florida without Gabby, the narrative changed instantly. Not publicly. Privately. Inside families. Inside phone calls. Inside unanswered messages. Something no longer made sense. But before the country fully understood that, there was another detail investigators would later revisit repeatedly. The van. That white Ford Transit became more than transportation. It became a moving timeline. Every location mattered. Every witness sighting mattered. Every parking area mattered. And eventually, internet users analyzing travel footage identified the van parked near a remote camping area in Wyoming. At first glance, the footage looked meaningless. Just another van beside a dirt road. But investigators later realized that clip may have captured one of the final known locations connected to Gabby. That's when public fascination intensified dramatically. Because for the first time, ordinary people online appeared capable of helping solve an active investigation. And that blurred the line between audience and investigator. Everyone began searching for hidden details, including details hidden inside the bodycam footage itself. One of the most unsettling aspects of the Moab footage isn't what happens. It's what doesn't happen. Nobody appears to fully grasp the stakes. Not Gabby. Not officers. Not viewers at the time. The interaction feels temporary. Recoverable. But behavioral analysts later pointed towards several subtle indicators. Gabby's rapid self-blame. Her visible fear of separation. Her emotional dysregulation paired against Brian's composure. And perhaps most importantly, her repeated attempts to minimize conflict. Again, none of these details prove violence. That's important. Human relationships are complicated. People respond differently to stress. But what investigators later recognized was pattern consistency. The same emotional dynamic appeared repeatedly across multiple interactions. And patterns matter far more than isolated moments. Especially in cases involving escalating interpersonal conflict. Because escalation rarely begins suddenly. It develops. Quietly. Incrementally. Until eventually one person loses control of the narrative entirely. By early September, concern inside Gabby's family intensified. Phone calls went unanswered. Communication patterns changed. And the silence surrounding Brian Laundrie became increasingly alarming. No public explanation. No visible search effort. No immediate cooperation. From an investigative perspective, silence itself isn't evidence. But behavior surrounding critical events often becomes psychologically revealing. And Brian's silence created an expanding vacuum. A vacuum quickly filled by speculation. Questions. Fear. What happened in Wyoming? When was Gabby last seen alive? Why come home without her? Why remain silent? And perhaps most hauntingly, at what exact moment did this stop being a troubled road trip and become something far darker? The country still didn't know yet. But investigators were already beginning to understand one thing. The timeline surrounding Gabby Petito's final days contained too many inconsistencies to dismiss. And somewhere hidden inside those inconsistencies was a single detail capable of collapsing the entire story. They just hadn't found it yet. The internet, meanwhile, moved faster than traditional investigations. TikTok creators, Reddit users, YouTube analysts. Everyone began reconstructing the road trip independently. People compared dates, mapped locations, examined captions, studied travel distances. And as the public timeline expanded, so did the unease. Because the online image of Gabby and Brian now felt deeply disconnected from reality. The smiling photographs no longer looked carefree. They looked staged. Fragile. Like snapshots taken moments before collapse. And one recurring observation appeared everywhere. Gabby often looked emotionally invested in maintaining the relationship. Brian often appeared emotionally detached from maintaining appearances once conflict emerged. Again, not proof. But pattern. Always pattern. That's what investigators follow. Not single moments. Repeated behaviors. Repeated reactions. Repeated emotional dynamics. And by this point in the story, one uncomfortable possibility was beginning to emerge. The relationship itself may have already been unraveling long before the public ever noticed. Then came the final communications. Sparse. Uncertain. Disconnected. Messages family members later described as unusual. At times emotionally flat. At times strangely worded. One message referenced Yosemite. Another lacked Gabby's normal tone. Again, none of these details alone prove anything. But investigators eventually asked a critical question. Were these messages attempts to maintain the illusion that everything was still normal? Because if so, that means whoever sent them understood something psychologically important. Time matters in disappearances. The longer normalcy appears intact, the longer scrutiny is delayed. And delays create opportunity. Opportunity to travel. Opportunity to reposition. Opportunity to prepare. That possibility transformed the investigation entirely. Now detectives weren't simply looking for a missing person. They were reconstructing narrative control. Who controlled information? Who controlled communication? Who controlled movement? And once investigators started examining the case through that lens, Brian Laundrie's behavior became far more difficult to ignore. There's another reason the Gabby Petito case resonated so deeply with the American public. It shattered the illusion that danger always looks obvious. Nothing about the road trip initially appeared extraordinary. No dramatic criminal history. No public threats. No obvious signs of impending violence. Instead, the story unfolded through ordinary moments. Arguments. Stress. Emotional imbalance. Isolation. And that's precisely what made the case unsettling. Because viewers recognized pieces of real relationships inside it. Not necessarily criminal relationships. Human relationships. The pressure of travel. Financial uncertainty. Mental strain. Communication breakdown. But somewhere inside those ordinary stressors, something escalated catastrophically. And investigators were still trying to determine exactly when. As September approached, the timeline narrowed dangerously. Gabby's confirmed activity faded. Brian's movements became increasingly important. Witnesses later described seeing him alone. Family concern intensified. And online investigators kept circling back to the same footage. The Bodycam stopped. Not because it solved the mystery, but because it seemed to contain the emotional blueprint of everything that followed. One person apologizing. One person remaining calm. One person trying desperately to stabilize conflict. And the other appearing strangely comfortable while the relationship visibly fractured. Again, behavior isn't verdict. But behavior creates context. And context changes how evidence is interpreted. Especially after someone disappears. Then came the silence. The kind that spread slowly. Family messages unanswered. Calls ignored. No confirmed sightings. And eventually, one impossible reality began forming. Gabby Petito might not simply be missing. Something far worse may have already happened. But investigators still lacked one thing. A definitive break in the timeline. The exact moment normal life ended. And until they found it, the case remained suspended between uncertainty and catastrophe. Meanwhile, Brian Laundrie remained home in Florida. With the van. Without Gabby. And without explanation. That silence became the center of the story. Because every unanswered question now pointed toward him. Not conclusively. Not legally. But psychologically. The absence of urgency. The refusal to explain. The retreat from public scrutiny. Each behavior intensified suspicion. And investigators began noticing another pattern. Whenever pressure increased, Brian appeared to withdraw rather than confront. Distance instead of engagement. Silence instead of clarification. That behavioral tendency would become critically important later. Because eventually, the entire investigation would hinge on what Brian did after Gabby vanished. Not before. After. And by then, the country was already watching. The final days of August now looked different in hindsight. Not peaceful. Not adventurous. Compressed. Volatile. like a story narrowing toward a point of collapse. And hidden inside that collapse was a detail investigators still didn't fully understand. A mistake. Small at first. Almost invisible. But once placed inside the timeline, it would begin unraveling the entire narrative. The problem was, nobody knew exactly where to look yet. Because at this point, the public still believed the story might have another explanation. Maybe Gabby wanted space. Maybe the couple separated temporarily. Maybe communication issues created confusion. But underneath those possibilities sat a darker reality investigators could no longer ignore. People don't normally disappear without pattern interruption. And Gabby's entire digital and emotional footprint appeared interrupted all at once. Abruptly. Almost surgically. That's what frightened investigators most. Not chaos. Absence. The sudden disappearance of normal behavior. And once they focused on that disappearance closely enough, the timeline began collapsing fast. In the weeks ahead, America would become consumed by the case. Then came the timeline gap. One of the most critical elements in the entire case. Because investigators eventually realized there was a narrowing window in which everything changed. A period where Gabby's normal communication abruptly stopped. A period where Brian's movements became difficult to fully explain publicly. And a period where digital evidence began contradicting the image still presented online. That contradiction became central to the investigation. Because on social media, the couple still appeared adventurous. Still traveling. Still together. But behind that image, communication patterns were deteriorating rapidly. And once investigators started layering witness sightings against phone activity, travel routes, and digital timestamps, the illusion began falling apart. Not suddenly. Piece by piece. And one phrase appeared constantly across online discussions. Something doesn't add up. That phrase became the emotional core of the case. Not certainty. Not evidence. Unease. The feeling that small details kept colliding in ways that created a larger, darker picture. And once that feeling took hold publicly, the investigation entered a completely different phase. Because now pressure wasn't only coming from law enforcement. It was coming from national attention. Continuous attention. Relentless attention. Every movement mattered. Every silence mattered. Every inconsistency mattered. Because soon, Brian Laundrie would disappear too. And once that happened, the entire case would transform from a missing person investigation into a nationwide manhunt. But before investigators reached that stage, they still had one final hope. That Gabby Petito might somehow still be found alive. And for a brief moment, the country held on to that possibility. Even as the timeline continued collapsing around it. Then came the realization investigators feared most. The arguments no longer looked ordinary. The apologies no longer looked harmless. The silence no longer looked neutral. Everything became part of a larger structure investigators were only beginning to understand. A structure built around control. Escalation. Withdrawal. And narrative management. Within days, that structure would begin collapsing publicly. Search teams would move into Wyoming. The FBI would intensify involvement. Internet investigators would uncover critical location evidence. And America would become consumed by one question. What really happened to Gabby Petito? But before that answer emerged, another mystery was already beginning. One centered entirely around Brian Laundrie. Because while Gabby's family searched desperately for answers, Brian stopped talking. Then he vanished. And suddenly, investigators weren't searching for one missing person anymore. They were searching for two. But what nobody realized yet was that one small piece of digital evidence had already changed everything. A van captured on camera, parked for seconds beside a remote Wyoming campsite. At the time, it looked meaningless. And once that footage surfaced, the entire case exploded.